Overgrowth is a title that has been in development for nearly a decade, with its creators posting regular videos and explanation of build changes, and offering downloads of those builds. My email receipt tells me I bought the game in mid-2012, and I occasionally downloaded a build to look at what was going on. Now it's out for realsies, and includes the campaign of its predecessor, Lugaru. I want to like Overgrowth, and I certainly got a kick out of some of the set pieces. There were some cool moments and some amusing dialogue. However, I also can't say I consistently enjoyed it. It's a game that has issues that prevent it from reaching the heights I feel it should. Part of that is the level and objective design. The engine seems designed to handle these large open areas, and the game certainly seems to feature those, but the player tends to be limited to fairly small or narrow areas, and the objectives tend to revolve around several fights, clearing out a camp, or platforming over or up something. That's fine, of course, but with such large maps it feels like more could have happened within each one, and the game as a whole feels somewhat disjointed. In one level, we're told to kill some dogs who are defending a fort. But when we do that, the next level immediately loads and we're in a completely different location starting at a platforming challenge. Almost every level is like this, and as a result there is no sense of place to be found. While mid-level saves do not appear to be a thing, checkpoints certainly are, and I feel like this issue could have been mitigated if levels contained a combination of these objectives and had the player move from one place to another. The combat levels themselves are fine. Cover for some stealth, lots of buildings to run around and jump on top of for some verticality. The player is a rabbit after all, and their gimmick is leg strength. The platforming challenges are more remarkable, and the penultimate level of the game is an enjoyable climb. As I said before, the architecture is mostly good looking, but in a way that adds to the issue I'm getting at. In short, to me, the title feels like an open world game with all the travel taken out, and I don't think that's a point in its favour. The wide open vistas and cool architecture promise a certain openness, and disappointment is inevitable when that doesn't materialise. Movement itself generally feels nice on the ground, and jumps carry a heavy sense of momentum with them. Jump kicks in combat are high damage and fairly difficult to pull off, making them very satisfying. That momentum can make landing precise jumps a little frustrating, and while generous checkpoints during the platforming levels ensure it doesn't become a huge issue, it would have been nice to have a way to kill momentum on landing. The real issues I have with the platforming stem from the way wall running and wall jumps work. The lack of air control is sometimes tedious, but is not mystifying the same way those elements are. The game introduces wall running as a way to extend distance fairly early, but the level where it started to bother me was the ice cliff climb. Rather than being able to ride across a wall, as it were, Turner seems to bounce off the surface in a second or so, no matter the approach angle, which leads to frustration in situations where the player is seemingly expected to do a long wall run to reach a platform a long distance away. It functions, but in a way that is not congruent with my expectations. Overall, while I stand by my statement that the platforming sections are well-designed levels, the floaty and imprecise controls for jumping take some fun out of them, and, while they are well designed, they don't truly capitalise on the momentum and speed that can be gained while making long jumps. Precision is fine, but landing a series of downhill jumps to build up speed and launch oneself a vast distance is something I suspect would work quite well, yet the player is never asked to perform such a manoeuvre. Let's tackle combat. Combat in Overgrowth is both complex and simple. There are comparatively few inputs, with lots of modifiers for attacks depending on your distance and movement relative to your enemy, but the kicker is that most of those don't really matter. It would be silly of me to state that the game lacks a skill requirement, but in my playthrough on hardcore difficulty and some jaunts into expert, it feels to me like in many combat situations the player's survival is a matter of luck. This is another reason the generous checkpointing is appreciated, though that is lacking in the Lugaru and Therium campaigns. Essentially, the player holds the attack button and moves close to the enemy to attack, which will occur when they enter effective range. Crouching results in a leg sweep, which can trip enemies over. They can also be thrown by holding another button as an attack against the player is executed, though this itself can be countered by both the player and enemies. Enemies' stances can be seen by observation, so it is theoretically possible to predict attacks, but in my experience an attack stance is no guarantee an enemy will actually attack, which contributes to the luck element I mentioned. In addition, attacks seem to be blocked automatically when outside of an attack stance, which contributes to the issue. All of this combines to mean that the only consistent combat strategy I found was waiting out and countering, which brings its own difficulties. Timing counters isn't exactly easy, especially on expert, and since counters demand the button be held for what feels like a long time, it itself demands commitment. There is a sort of locational damage. Being stabbed in the arm or leg will not kill the player or enemies, but taking a solid thrust to the chest will kill anything without armor. This naturally means that the player can be killed by a glancing slash across the neck instantly, while also surviving a full blow if they take it in the arm. This is arguably realistic, and gives the combat a certain tension which it would lack otherwise. I appreciate this approach, but it isn't long until the player starts coming up against heavily armoured enemies. Given that there can be no guarantee of where anyone will take any particular hit, and that the player never obtains any armour, I feel a more abstracted health system may have helped the game feel less luck-based. Alternatively, perhaps some blunt weapons would have helped matters. In my experience, Turner is capable of killing virtually anything with 2 or 3 jump kicks to the face, no matter the armour, and the capability of wielding blunt weapons would give an edge against armour users without requiring exclusive use of the jump kick, which on top of being difficult to land, puts the player at risk of getting their balls cut off and dying immediately. Ultimately, I feel like the combat is both the game's greatest strength and worst weakness. It is an extremely compelling system on paper and has obviously seen a huge amount of effort. It is very quick and lethal and often exhilarating. However, it can also feel inconsistent, and when one side is armoured and or heavily armed can easily become frustrating, especially given the game's expectation for the player to take down multiple enemies between checkpoints. Again, this is realistic, but it's also realistic to assume Turner could steal armour from enemy rabbits and keep weapons between levels, neither of which can actually occur. I feel one good example of this combat frustration is the last boss. After dispatching a rabbit's guards, a cutscene plays, then he attacks the player. This would be fine, only the player is standing about a foot away when the cutscene ends and their weapons are taken away. When I did this fight, he always performed a quick kick followed by a sword slash, which killed me every time. It's possible to get away from this, I know because I managed to do it once, but I mostly ended up just getting murdered a lot. The most reliable way to break it, I found, was countering the first kick. Needless to say, this is quite tight, and I feel as the final encounter of the main campaign, it falls a little flat, because after that opener he is just like any other armoured rabbit. Again, that's realistic, but it felt somewhat anticlimactic. The fight is for entry to a safe city for rabbits, and Turner effectively just turns around and says he's going back out to keep killing people, somewhat strange since in the game's opening he just wants some peace and quiet. Speaking of which, the story. The game starts with Turner, the protagonist, arriving at an allegedly safe village just as it is attacked by slavers. What follows is a relentlessly bleak series of events and characters, with Turner displaying a death wish and throwing himself into bad odds constantly to help other rabbits and kill every bad person in sight, as well as a few good people. Given that in the precursor events in Lugaru his entire village is murdered, it's reasonable to assume his behaviour is probably a result of that. While the story is bleak, it does offer some glimmers of hope. Despite Turner's determination to head out into danger again, the surviving, supporting cast all get their safe space. I'm not going to say that the story is rich and nuanced, but it moves things along and serves as a vehicle for gameplay just fine. As I stated before, it has some amusing dialogue in it, and I feel it may have served more convincing world building if the levels were larger and more contiguous. Ultimately, Overgrowth shows a lot of promise and potential, but unfortunately lets itself down with its level layouts and brings a lot of frustration to the table between its two major mechanics. But I still think it's a good game.